But first, it's been quite a week for setting up inquiries into historic child abuse and paedophilia allegations, along with an unmistakable whiff of cover-up and conspiracy.
I'm absolutely determined that we're going to get to the bottom of these allegations, and we're going to leave no stone unturned to find out the truth about what happened.
But this hasn't just happened out of the blue. Journalists have been breaking stories and drawing attention to some of these issues for some considerable time. Most recently, it's been the investigative website-based news agency Exaro that's been leading the way, with, by my count, at least 100 articles since 2012 alone. Well, as you heard there, the government are now taking notice and have set up 2 high-level inquiries, one into how public bodies and institutions, including the BBC, have handled historic allegations of paedophilia and child abuse, and another into how the Home Office and the police have dealt with matters. Or not. Mark Watts is the editor-in-chief of Exaro, and he joins me now. Mark, many thanks indeed for coming.
Hello.
You've been at this, I think, this particular story, or variations on it, since 2012. What got you started?
At the very start, this was, if you remember, in the wake of the exposure of Jimmy Savile, we started picking up on evidence of paedophiles at the top of British politics. VIP paedophiles, not just politics actually, in other areas too. And the very specific thing were allegations surrounding events that had happened some time ago at Elm Guest House and the curious people who turned up.
And if I recall, the suggestion was that Elm Guest House, that young boys were being brought from children's homes and whatever, and were being abused in...
We were able to prove beyond any doubt it was basically a paedophile brothel.
Right.
And there was also no doubt that some very eminent people would frequent the place. And in fact, fairly recently, the Met has confirmed one specific example, the late Liberal MP Cyril Smith, as one person who enjoyed visits there.
Right. Now, let's just go back a little bit. So you've been at this since 2012. What has the reaction of other media been to your sort of string of stories?
Well, it was very interesting because, of course, Exaro does work with mainstream media outlets. We work with national newspapers and news programmes such as Channel 4 News and Newsnight. And you have to remember, when we started investigating, before we published anything, before we published our first story, was the disastrous Newsnight story that didn't name but implicitly identified McAlpine, and we knew that.
I should say completely wrongly, as a suspected paedophile.
Absolutely, and we were horrified because we knew they'd got it wrong, and in fact we were working on the story at proving exactly how they got it wrong. In fact, the Guardian got there before us. But it was a disaster for us because we knew it would make it seem as though what we were on about was wrong, was too similar. And what we found when we approached newspapers is they had, the McAlpine judders. They just thought, we're going to have another one. Because a lot of our stories revolved around a former, so far unnamed ex-cabinet minister who is at the centre of allegations of child sex abuse.
So what changed it then? At what point did they start to get interested? Because obviously now people, I imagine, are crawling all over you.
Well, actually, to be fair, we've done a lot of stories with the likes of the Sunday People in particular, but also the Sunday Mirror. We did stuff with Channel 4 News along the way over the 2 years that we've been doing stories. I think the turning point came when we were approached by Zach Goldsmith, the Conservative MP, represents Richmond, which is the constituency in which Elm Guest House is placed, and he was very worried about our stories and said, I want to do something about this. Can you help me put together a little group of MPs to call on for some sort of inquiry? And we had a discussion about what that should be, and we pulled together a little group of 7 MPs, and they agreed to write a joint letter to the Home Secretary that called for it. So of course we ran the story, what we thought was a very simple, straightforward story. 7 MPs call for this, and there's some notable names: Zach Goldsmith, Tim Lawton, former Children's Minister,
and that's when it started to gain traction.
Well, what happened was our Twitter followers started asking their MPs, do you back these guys? Do you back these 7? And before we knew it, there were more than 140 MPs calling for this overarching inquiry into institutionalised, organised child sex abuse.
Now, we don't have long, unfortunately, but by my reading of it, there's quite a lot of strands to this floating about. There's the Cyril Smith allegations, there's Peter Wrighton, who's now dead, but a well-known paedophile, exposed originally in the early 90s, actually, by the Mail and I think the BBC Inside Story. There's the Geoffrey Dickens dossier, there's the North Wales abuse story. There's quite a lot of strands here. Now, is it your belief that these might be connected by a similar approach, in that things that perhaps should have been looked into weren't, or do you think there is in fact an overarching conspiracy that connects them?
I think these things never work simply. I think it's often wrong to think in terms of a paedophile ring. There are interlocking, interconnecting rings. There's a network. And what we're looking at here overall is what's going to, I think, emerge as the most astonishing scandal that British politics has seen.
Do you think there are, in fact, connections between all those things?
They do connect in one way or the other, yes. And what seems to be the case is that there are some powerful politicians, powerful people in other walks of life, who, in interlocking rings in a network, were getting access to boys in
just one last question, I'll say it briefly if you can. Lady Butler Schloss has been announced as the chair of the main inquiry, and she has lots of long experience of child abuse and unimpeachable reputation as far as one knows. But her brother was Sir Michael Havers, who was the Attorney General back in the 1980s when some of these events have been looked at. Do you think her position is sustainable as chair of the inquiry?
I think there's been a massive mistake in deciding on a key decision for this inquiry as to who this chairman would be without consulting the victims, the survivors of child sex abuse. These are people who've not been listened to for decades. We're at the start of this inquiry. They've already repeated the mistake. It's an absolute outrage. I'm not saying she's the wrong person.
Good.
I'm saying they should have consulted.
OK, Mark Watts, many thanks indeed. I'm sure this is one we'll come back to.